What you are about to witness is a fascinating interview with a gentleman called Christopher Spencer, or rather that is his pen name. He has to conceal his real name. In the following interview, Christopher speaks about his 50 plus years in the world of high-level finance, both as a banker and a finance and investment broker. He covers everything from international espionage to covert financial agreements, conmen, murder, war, and more, with a touch of personal flair. Everything you are about to hear is true. Some questions were pre-agreed and scripted to explain specific content in his books. Most are not. You can find details of where to buy his books in the video description below. This is part 15. So, throughout your entire career, have you ever witnessed any instances of corruption or illegal activity? And if so, can you tell us how you navigated these situations? So the idea being, it's a situation you found yourself in where this kind of activity is taking place, and maybe you ran the risk of being sucked into it, or maybe it was part of a project, something someone else is doing, and you had to keep yourself away from it. Or as you mentioned earlier, sometimes there's a project where there's a percentage of bribery that has to be taken into account, and there's not much choice you've got except to be honest, that kind of thing.
Corruption is widespread, as I mentioned before. Whichever country that you're dealing with, you have to understand what the niceties are, what the amounts are, and although of course there's now been legislation against corruption and bribery in a number of Western countries, I'm afraid it still goes on. So in my career, I've seen it at first hand on numerous occasions. I've known what has been involved. I've known about how the company who's trying to sell its goods and services overseas, how it's dealt with it. And there are various ways of dealing with it. Obviously, there is the numbered Swiss bank account, or in the Virgin Islands, or wherever the tax regimes are attractive, and where money can be hidden behind bank accounts that are numbered, or between trusts or corporations. This goes on. I believe it still goes on. It's not a nice subject, but if you want work, you've got to fall in with this situation. Otherwise, the work is going to go to your competitors, and those competitors might include Chinese companies or Russian companies who have got absolutely no worries at all about bribing politicians and government officials to get the work needed. Did it cause me any moral questions? Well, yes, it did. I must say, at some stages, when I heard about what the percentage was involved in a particular contract, obviously I won't mention any names, I was very amazed by the level that we were talking about. It was a particularly big contract as well. I was asked whether I could advise the company to do it better, because they were worried about being found out. Subsequently, they were found out in a little bit of a way, but such was the importance that they managed to bury it all in the end. I did try to help them with one or two carefully placed suggestions, but I didn't like doing that. It wasn't part of my job, I must say, to negotiate these kind of arrangements, but I was aware of it happening. I needed to know, because I had to clear it in some cases with government. I had to clear it with the financial institutions involved. But it still goes on, I'm afraid. And I have the attitude that if we don't do it, well, we'll miss out. I mean, the fact is that Britain no longer is dominant in any way in the international construction market. These days, British companies just don't win contracts, partly because overseas countries now have their own expertise they can build these projects for themselves, and so they don't need us. But in the days of my experience in the 1980s and the 1990s, this wasn't the case. And still, these payments were demanded in order to get a contract and to get work and exports for the companies involved. And nowadays, of course, conmen, they're very prevalent, and they take money off individuals more than anything else. But I've seen examples of conmen trying to take money off big companies, businesses even, of other smaller size. I mean, I've written about one particular case where the conmen, they're very sophisticated, and they pretended to be from the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States. It was very well set up. I travelled on this journey. I went to the West Country, I went to Switzerland, I went to Paris, and then eventually I found out it was a contract thanks to the intelligence organizations. That's the British and the Americans working together. But there are many other examples. Later on, and I'm talking now in the 90s, I met a very eminent conman, shall we call him. He had one leg, by the way, which is very interesting. He had an accident as a child and had one leg, but he was organizing, shall we say, a group of other people to act as his assistants. And also, he tried to bring in people of reputation, because if the conmen can see, can show people that have a good reputation are involved in this business in some way, then they're much more credible to go to other people and say, okay, there's this particular investment opportunity. Of course, it's very, very good. And of course, to get in it, you have to make an advance payment of some kind. And then, of course, there is no investment, and they disappear with your money. So the more that they can get honest people involved as front people, the better. And this guy was trying to do. I know all kinds of companies are involved in this process. I mean, I was in construction, but other projects involving, for example, if a country is buying a new power station, all the equipment that comes into that power station, the boilers, etc., are all subject to a percentage if that company is going to get the business. Similarly, I think it's the case that if you're selling food into a particular country and dealing with the government, shall we say, in order to do that, then ministers or officials will come out of the woodwork and say, look, we want a cut of the action, please, because you're going to make some profits out of this, dealing with our country, and you better give us a percentage of it. So, in many ways, it applies to all sectors, and whatever it might be, whether it's a project or a sale to government, that certainly applies. But you'd also find it, I think, if you were selling to the private sector in some companies, somebody would crawl out of the woodwork and say, okay, if we order your stuff, how much will you pay me in order to make sure that order goes through?
Many people assume that the ultra wealthy are above the law and can basically get away with everything or anything or other. In your experience, how much truth is there to that belief?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would like to think that in the UK, rich people or well-connected people who come from a very good background are not above the law. But in my personal experience, I have found that it does depend on your background, particularly on what kind of sentence you might get if you're found guilty. I have a particular example of one guy who, like myself, was a grammar school boy, and didn't go to university but took a professional qualification, and then later on in life he was charged with a crime. Not a particularly serious crime, but he got a jail sentence of quite a few number of years. He had to serve part of that sentence in a closed prison, and only in the last year of his sentence was he allowed to go to an open prison. Now, earlier on, he had introduced me to a gentleman who was in a prominent position. Obviously, he'd gone to the right kind of private school, public school. He served in the right kind of army regiment, one of the Guards regiments. He was found guilty of a crime where the amount was involved was many times the amount that the first gentleman was accused of. He actually stole from his family a very large amount of money, even from his poor wretched mother. What did he get? 1 year in an open prison. Now, can you say that the judge actually considered all the facts here? I don't think so. I think what was considered was his background, his education, and his service in a prime regiment in the British Army. When you look overseas, obviously the amount of corruption is much more, particularly in developing countries, I'm sad to say, because that holds back very much the development of those countries, because so much money is stolen by ministers, by civil servants, and by others.